Thank you. If the world is becoming a better place, I think Sweden has a big role in that process. And it was a little sub-theme in my book, Winning the War on War. We said the secret subtitle was How the Swedes Are Saving the World. So I very much appreciate being able to be in this wonderful country and this great university on such an occasion, and to be able to follow the distinguished foreign minister. And also that you're willing to speak in English with me and not Swedish. So thank you for that. It's no secret that world politics and diplomacy are a very male-dominated sphere. And here we have the recent Syrian peace negotiations with a whole room full of men talking about the war. The United States president here is cutting off funding for women's health care around the world, surrounded by a room full of men. In the APEC summit meeting in 1997, the male leaders of that summit dressed up in matching bomber jackets for a moment of male bonding. And if we come back 20 years later, the picture has changed, because Michelle Bachelet is now in there, one woman, and at this rate, the APEC summit meeting will be equal numbers of men and women in only 200 more years. See, the world is getting to be a better place. In today's uniformed state armies, it's about 20 million people, 97% of the soldiers, participants are male, and about the same in peacekeeping, although it's beginning to change very slowly. And in designated combat forces, which is several million people, well over 99% are male. Now, all feminists would agree that women have the right to participate in these venues, to be represented, and to have access to the resources that come out of these processes, and also to vote, to drive, to own property, divorce, be safe from violence. But now I'm going to talk about some complex and controversial things that I want to expand the discussion into, but because time's very short, I'm going to simplify them. So I apologize for that, and you might not agree with me, but here are some ideas. I'll talk about difference feminism and liberal feminism, two varieties that agree on these basic points, but difference feminists would tend to say that women bring special qualities as women to, let's say, diplomacy, and specifically that women are more peaceful and men are more aggressive, and that these are very fundamental differences between the two genders. Liberal feminists see men and women as very much more similar, and that the inclusion of women, in addition to being a rights issue, will bring the other half of the talent pool to the table, so you'll get better outcomes by not excluding people because of their gender. In daily conversation, we often hear men are like this and women are like this. Every day I hear this. And even that men are from Mars, women are from Venus, different species, different down to the cellular level. But when you look at actual gender differences on any particular capability along the horizontal axis and the number of people on the vertical axis, we find bell curves, most people in the middle, and then they're spread out to the sides. And in most cases, other than childbirth, where there really are categorical differences, but on most other dimensions, you'll find often little shifts in the averages between the groups, but also a great deal of overlap. And this means that an individual's position on this scale is not determined by their gender. They're men and women along the two sides, but there tend to be average differences. And so liberal feminism tries to overcome the tyranny of averages, in which an individual is judged by the average of their group, and to judge individuals based on their merit, not their gender. People are diverse on many different dimensions, and diversity is good in strengthening an organization, such as a foreign ministry or military negotiations. But gender is only one of the categories on which people differ, and not necessarily the most important one. I would say it's not the most important one. Let me give an example here from a difference feminist perspective. Anthropologist Helen Fisher 10 years ago said, men and women did not evolve to have the same brain. We're finding more and more gender differences in the brain. One of them is women's verbal ability. Women can talk. So if you look at the data on verbal ability from the American college entrance exams, you find it's true. Women score higher on average than men on this test of verbal ability. But you also find that most people are in the overlap zone, and that some men are very verbal, some women not very verbal. You couldn't judge an individual's verbal ability very well just based on their gender. And this is true of other capabilities, such as harm avoidance or risk acceptance. Are men more accepting of risk and women avoid harm more? Yes, on average, but most people are in the overlap zone. And basic differences like how fast people run. Men run faster on average, but a lot of women are faster than almost all the men. Height is a crucial one to me because I'm way at the end here, not at the average. And there are women who are taller than almost all the men. Well, taller than the average man anyway. And I've met women taller than me, so the individuals differ. And even in upper body strength, which is the greatest of the physical gender differences because it's keyed by testosterone in puberty, there are women stronger in their upper body strength than men. These data are from the US Army. So the left side of the bell curve has been crunched in because the weaker people are not getting into the Army, whether they're men or women. And also the data are from 1982. So in those days, most women were eating and exercising to be thin, and most men were eating and exercising to be strong. And you used to see at the gym the aerobic equipment all occupied by women, and the weightlifting all occupied by men, which is not true anymore. I think I'm trying to get updated data here, and I think you would find more overlap now of women having more upper body strength. The point is, even on these, the greatest physiological differences, there is some overlap. So again, when you hear men are like this and women are like that, think to yourself, well, on average, but with a lot of overlap, and you can't tell where an individual will fall. Now let me talk about several problems with treating men and women as categorically different when we're thinking about world politics and diplomacy. And the first one is obvious, reinforcing gender stereotypes. When an individual fits a gender stereotype, we tend to attribute their behavior or qualities to their gender, such as if a man is violent, it's because he's a man. But if an individual doesn't fit, like a man is very gentle and nonviolent, we don't say that's because he's a man. We just say that's an individual quality. So it makes it hard because gender stereotypes have a grain of truth. That's the average difference. And then we filter and judge people when they fit the stereotype, but filter out when they don't fit. And stereotypes can be part of old stories that reinforce patriarchy. For instance, women need protection. This is an old story. The UN Security Council Resolution 1325 uses the word protect 7 different times to refer to women. And this is practical, and I'm not criticizing it, but I want to think a little bit about it. Valerie Hudson even says that we should extend the idea of R2P, the responsibility to protect civilians, as being R2PW, responsibility to protect women. And the problem I have with it is the message that it means that women are weak, men are strong. So we're reinforcing, and it's not an empowering message about women. And it even extends to our discussions of sexual violence in wartime. This is an American anti-Japanese poster from World War II. That women are victims. Now, we want to pay attention to sexual violence in wartime, for sure, and it's good that we're paying more attention than had been the case. But this discourse that women are victims, women are powerless, and that violence against women is somehow different than violence against men, I'm a little bit suspicious of it. Men get, rape is a form of torture, but is it really that different than an electric drill to the skull or the tortures that are inflicted on men in wartime? And men are also sexually tortured in wartime. So I think that when men are tortured and women are tortured in wartime, there's a different take on it, possibly because the stereotype is the women are innocent and helpless and the men are somehow compromised by their gender as to their status as victims. Similarly, we hear the phrase, women are the main victims of war. And I don't think this is true. Both genders are victims of war. If anything, more men get killed in war than women do. If you look at here, the number of people is on the horizontal axis and the age is on the vertical axis. This is Russia after World War II, a war that was particularly hard on civilian society, a lot of starvation, a lot of destruction of infrastructure. And you see that the male side is just crushed in. More men died in the war. And this is also true of the war in Syria today. I've heard a number as high as 85% of the fatalities in Syria, men. In Srebrenica in Bosnia, the war criminals separated the population by gender, put the women on buses after taking the ones they wanted to rape and torture, and then killed all the men. And in the iconic discourse in international relations, the Thucydides Melian dialogue, Thucydides says, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And what was it that the strong did and the weak suffered? It was just like Srebrenica, take the women for slavery and rape, kill all the men. Who's the main victim? You know, I don't think it's a useful way to think of it. They're both victims. In violence generally in the world, more than 3/4 of the victims of homicide are men, and the majority of victims of all violent crime are men. Now, of course, the perpetrators are also men, but the victims are men. And in refugee populations, oftentimes the most vulnerable are the men, especially what we call battle-aged men, who just by virtue of their gender and their age are considered to be possibly suitable for military service, even though they may be civilians with no connection to military service. And they're prone to losing their civilian immunity because of that, and to be plucked out of a refugee population and either killed or inducted into military service, which may amount to the same thing. And in this, we have the related concept that you hear, women and children are the majority of refugees. Now, this is true. Most refugee populations, like the populations they're drawn from, are about half children and about half men and women in the adult population. So it's true, women and children are 3/4 of the population of refugees. But it's also true that men and children are the majority of refugees, and yet you never hear this term, men and children. So here we've reinforced a stereotype that women are like children, they're innocent, they're helpless, they're weak. And I think we should suspect that. So that's the problem of reinforcing gender stereotypes. Now, second problem that I have with the difference approach is that it encourages gender segregation. If men and women are on different planets, then of course they'll grow up separately and live in different worlds and not have much interaction with each other. But babies actually start out ungendered. You have to look very hard to see if there's a little bump or a little dimple between the legs, and otherwise they're physiologically the same, and they will stay the same for 8 years. Same testosterone levels, same body, same physiology for 8 years, and then slowly differentiate into puberty. And yet we put great effort into gendering them from the earliest age. I call it gender apartheid. We have separate colors. It's a boy. First thing you want to know about a baby, what is it, a boy or a girl? Because that's all important. Or it's a girl, pink. Pink, pink, pink. It's like a segment of the electromagnetic spectrum, a little piece of physics that's reserved for one gender. The baby's teeth are identical, but the girl is going to get a diamond ring, pink diamond ring for a sweet baby girl, and the boy gets a power tool for a busy baby boy. And so on down through childhood. These examples are from Aaron Chack's hilarious take on BuzzFeed, which you can look up. They need separate candy, separate Scotch tape, separate ballpoint pens, separate tools. Girls can use tools as long as they're pink tools. We need separate aisles in the toy stores. Or if you can't decide what to get, just consider a gift card. And out of this, the children grow up in separate play groupings. Now, why do we put so much effort into gendering children this way? And my theory about it is that this is all because we use men to fight wars. Because war is gendered, that's why childhood is gendered the way it is. We're preparing young men, young boys, to become men who might need to fight wars someday. And the clue is in these separate play groups. When a girl crosses to the boy play group, dresses like a boy, cuts her hair short, climbs trees, plays with the boys. She's called a tomboy. My daughter was one, and it's okay. Everybody's cool about that. But if a boy crosses to the girl side and plays with dolls and wears dresses and like that, that's not okay. And that boy is likely to be, well, it's changing a little bit now in some places, but likely to be stigmatized and bullied for that. And that's because the boy is deserting from this path that could lead to military service in the future. And worse yet, might be setting an example for other boys who decide they like dolls better than trucks and so forth. So we crack down hard on that. So I don't think we fight wars because men are violent. I think we make men, encourage men's violence, and track them into it because we use men to fight wars. And this brings us to the important topic of men, which I always like to talk about. I want to say that my great frustration in gender studies and international relations and is that gender is equated with women, and we seldom hear about men. Men don't have gender. Men certainly don't want to talk about gender. On page 1 of my book, War and Gender, I say that it has to do with both men and women, but somewhat more about men, because it's about war, and men are the ones we're going to use for fighting wars. And yet, when I got an award from my university for this book, it referred to my contributions to studying women and war. It's just like the men are invisible. And we have to get men into the picture. So this brings me to my third problem with difference feminism, which is the problem of treating men as static, uniform, missing that whole bell curve, and mostly negative, rather than ever-changing, diverse, and mostly positive, which is how I see men. It misses some of the nuance and complexity of men and masculinity. And there can be a discourse emerging of denigrating men. Men are bad. Men need women to civilize them. This is also an old story. And you see the connection to the issue of women needing protection. Men are also portrayed as naturally promiscuous and irresponsible. And this is even attributed to evolution, that men can create a baby in minutes, but women take 9 months, so women are more invested in caring for offspring and so forth. It doesn't add up, because it actually takes 20 years to raise a baby to reproductive age, a whole generation. And having a lot of babies who starve and don't reproduce is not going to pass along your genes. There's 2 limiting factors. One is how many babies you make, and the other is how many of them survive to have their own babies. Now, if all the babies survived, a single couple would lead to a population of 10 billion people in less than 300 years. So the fact that it took millions of years shows you that that's not the limit. The limit is that they don't survive. The limit is investing in your offspring so that they survive, and men, therefore, would get their reproductive advantage and pass along their genes by investing in their children, just like women, right? Not by going around like James Bond, having a lot of babies with different women. So all these stereotypes that men are bad, violent, irresponsible, I don't think they hold up. And the reality is men are diverse and changing through time. First of all, gay men are often omitted from this whole Mars-Venus story. They just don't quite fit. Transgender people are not only omitted, but they illustrate how fluid gender really is. I can't change my age, height, race, and these things, but you can actually change your gender from one to the other, which is remarkable. And the norms around masculinity and what we consider to be manly are also diverse and fluid through time. Take Louis XIV, the great war-making king. Here he is in a particularly manly pose. The long hair, the flowing purple robes, the legs, the heels. This is a manly man of his time. Ramses II was another great maker of war. Here in his slender build, the long dress, the love of horses, these are all manly. And then we can look at the evolution of the American action figure G.I. Joe. In the 1960s, the ideal man was a slouchy guy with a rifle who got drafted and took up his duty to serve his country. But by the 1990s, with post-draft, all-volunteer military, emphasis on special forces, now the ideal man was G.I. Joe steroids, as I call them. And women have been able to stretch into men's roles more easily than men into women's roles, as I mentioned with tomboys. During the Vietnam War, we had the iconic image of a woman holding the baby and the gun, representing women's liberation. You can do both sides. But Cynthia Enloe asked in 1983, where's the picture of the male gorilla holding the rifle and the baby? I thought she was so smart. If we wait long enough, 30 years later in Aleppo, here we have him, he's finally there. And he went right onto the front cover of my international relations textbook, the man with the baby and the gun. So the point is, men and masculinity are diverse and changeable. I would also dispute the idea that men are naturally violent or warlike. or enjoy fighting, although certainly there are some who do. But on the contrary, societies go to great lengths to turn men into fighters. If it came naturally, we wouldn't need the draft, which I know in Sweden it's both genders now, but in the United States it's still, I just saw this in the post office, men, do the right thing. It's quick, it's easy, it's the law, It's the law, you have to register for the draft. And most societies do conscript in wartime because these men are not so violent and warlike that they just join up for the fun of it. And we start early preparing our sons to be soldiers in childhood, toughening up boys. Most societies in the world have rites of adolescent becoming a man, in which boys have to show bravery and strength such as they would need in wartime, such as this boy in Vanuatu who has to leap off a high platform with just these vines to keep him from crushing his skull. Once in the military, we strip away men's individuality and create conformity with uniforms and haircuts, as Stephen Colbert showed us in Iraq a decade ago. And then we give soldiers drugs, the rum ration in the British Army and so forth, to get them able to fight. Another way we get men to fight is by offering sexual rewards to the martyrs of battle. We know about the 72 virgins and all that controversial story. But here's a poster in Harvard Library of a World War I casualty being lifted up to heaven in the arms of a half-naked woman. And if soldiers survive, then many cultures promise access to females. Some particularly warlike societies require a man to fight or kill in war before being allowed to marry. Most societies give medals or other symbols of gratitude for the sacrifice of men in fighting wars. And despite all these incentives to get men to fight, many men in history have returned from war traumatized. And in the United States right now, we have several 100,000 of them. It's just a huge problem and heartbreaking. And I wrote about this in a recent book called The Wounds Within with a psychotherapist friend. The point is, fighting and being violent does not come naturally to men. Men are not innately violent. So when we think about gender in world politics and peace and diplomacy, let's think about more than protecting innocent women from violent men, although you want to do that, and about more than getting women represented in military and peacekeeping forces and diplomacy, although that's also very important. But let's imagine healing men from a lifetime of preparing or actually fighting wars. And let's imagine liberating women and men from the tyranny of gender roles, encouraging men to embrace childcare, not as a duty, but as a joy, and encouraging women to participate in military and diplomatic spheres, not because they're women, but because they're highly qualified individuals. Let's imagine building our institutions and practices around diversity of leadership and membership, together strengthening the whole by drawing on that whole bell curve, both bell curves, all the individuals with all that they bring to those institutions and processes. And let's judge individuals on their merit, not on their gender. Thank you very much.